Good day, everyone. My name is Patricia Rodriguez. I'm a geoscience and petrophysics advisor at Petro. Today, I'm going to present a couple of case studies on how to incorporate horizontal log data to map reservoir properties. In the past decade, the number of horizontal logs drilled has grown significantly. Development using horizontal logs translates into lack of vertical log data to properly map reservoir properties. For example, in North Dakota, we can see there are large areas without vertical control, like the ones that we see here in this red circle. However, these areas are usually covered by lots of horizontal wells. Similarly, in Colorado, we also have large areas without vertical control, like the ones we're highlighting here. Again, all these areas have been drilled with a lot of horizontal wells. And that information can be very useful to map and delineate the reservoirs. Horizontal logs are currently primarily used to assess geomechanical properties during or after completion operations, and there are not many published examples of incorporating horizontal logs into quantitative mapping of reservoir properties. There are many difficulties of using horizontal logs for reservoir mapping. Among them, we have that vertical and horizontal logs are sampling different rock volumes. The data normalization is tricky due to the differing statistics between the two measurements. And finally, the resistivity and sonic logs are measuring different rock geometries. Today, we'll show you two case studies in which the horizontal log data was incorporated quantitatively for that purpose. In the first case study, we incorporated triple combo data from horizontal logs into mapping the water saturation. In the second case, we use horizontal gamma ray data for facies distribution using seismic data. So let's start right away with the first case, which is the water saturation mapping using triple combo data from horizontal logs. First of all, I want to give you a quick background on the case study. The reservoir is an unconventional carbonate-rich mudstone. The mapping was done using vertical data, indicated that the water saturation was the main production driver. However, vertical wells were limited in the area, but the operator had recorded triple combo data in many of the horizontal wells. The workflow that we're going to explain here was done using Petra, but it can be reproduced in any other mapping platform. As a general workflow, the first pass of the model included the QC of the data, the gamma ray normalization, and the calculation of the porosity model. Because of the limited depth of investigation of porosity tools, the same model used in the vertical wells was valid also for the horizontal wells. However, the water saturation model needed to be tuned to be consistent with the vertical well model. The inconsistency between the two models is due to the nature of the resistivity log, which is highly sensitive to the geometry of the measurement. In this case, the horizontal model needed a higher M and N and also a higher volume water reducible parameter than the vertical model. The final step was to filter the water saturation curve using geosteering information and the gamma ray log, which I'll explain in the next slides. So the water saturation curve is filtered to preserve only the data belonging to the target formation. To do this, we create a pay flag curve for the data that is in zone, based on the geosteering report, like I have an example here in the left. And we preserve the points also with low gamma ray only, which in this case, the cutoff that we used was gamma ray less than 100. This allows us to create a filtered water saturation curve. For the case that we're looking here, we have on the right the horizontal log. So in the first track, we have the gamma ray, then the density, rho B, the resistivity, the gas curve, the porosity, and the water saturation. The last curve in the track here is the filtered water saturation curve, which preserved only the data that actually was inside the reservoir. On the left, we have the geosteering cross-section with the blue here being our target formation. When it crosses the formation, we have the first points here, which are in this low gamma ray section, and then in the latter part of the well, we have all this data down here. Here, another example in how we filter the data. We have the same logs, they are just shown here horizontally, with the filter water saturation curve at the top. You can see that when the wells cross the formation, in this case is this lower light blue interval. So when the well crosses the formation, it's the only places where we are preserving the water saturation curve. Now, how do we incorporate this data into the mapping if you are using Petra? So the log data from the horizontals is exported as a CSV file, dropping the null values and including the location data in the file. Then we add the data back in the map as a control point. So we're exporting the logs, but they are going to be, since they're being exported in a CSV file, you re-import them as control points into the map. Now we create a map using the vertical data, but turning on an option that allows us to use the control points to help with the mapping. This will allow you to use both the data from the vertical wells and the control points which come from the horizontal data. As I said at the beginning, this workflow can be implemented in any mapping platform. The most important part is really to calibrate the model for the horizontal logs to be consistent with the vertical wells. Here's an example of the effect of adding the horizontal data in the map. In this map, we have the water saturation map using only the vertical data. The warm colors correspond to lower water saturation, while the cooler colors correspond to high water saturation. You see here, it's kind of hard to see, but you have all these points that are the vertical well data, and we have some horizontal wells here, which are not using the map currently. In this slide, we're showing only the control points that come from the horizontal using the same color scale that we saw before. They're hard to see, but if you look in detail here, we can see the points. These are red, these are green and yellow, and some here are in blue. So in this next slide, we have the same map that we have 2 slides ago, but now I plotted on top the horizontal control points. So you can see that there is consistency between the verticals and the horizontals. You see the red here where there is less water saturation corresponds to an area where we see more reds from the horizontal data. And the same here where we are in the green and yellow from the vertical wells. We see some green and yellow and some blues from the horizontal data. So now what we're going to do is that I'm going to go forward and show you how this map changes when we incorporate the horizontal data. So, and pay attention how the edges in particular are going to change. When you see here, you see that there is, as we incorporate the control points from the horizontal data, you can see how the map gets sharpened. You can see the edge much better. You can see here now an area of high water saturation that we didn't have before. And we see how the area of low water saturation gets expanded a little bit more forward towards the northwest of the map. Now I also want to show some examples on how the horizontal data provided insights about controls of water saturation across faults. In this well, we can see how the water saturation changes in the same well when we go across the fault. So the well here is inverted, but you can see that we have here 3 big faults, and we see that in the heel of the well, we have actually low water saturation, while in the toe of the well, we have much higher water saturation. Another similar example, we see that these points at the heel of the well that correspond to this area here, they have low water saturation, while at the toe of the well, we have higher water saturation. In this other area of the field, we also can see how the water situation increases progressively to the north when you look at adjacent wells. So you have these wells here, all of them have low water saturation. As we start moving up here, we start getting areas with higher and higher water saturation until we get to the top here where we have a much higher water saturation. Now we will move on to the second case study, in which we show the use of gamma ray logs from horizontals for facies distribution using seismic data. As we did before, we have here some background information. This again is an unconventional carbonate-rich mudstone. In the area of interest, we had only 7 vertical wells with a full suite of logs, but 95 horizontal wells with gamma ray data. From seismic, we got seismic attributes for acoustic impedance and BP/BS ratio. And the objective was to map the reservoir properties, but the vertical log data was not sufficient to add enough detail. The workflow consisted in first normalize the gamma ray data from horizontal wells using the vertical data. From the vertical wells, we calibrated a flag to separate brittle versus non-brittle rock using only gamma ray. We generate then the facies flag in horizontal wells using a gamma ray cutoff, and we then tune the time depth conversion to extract the inverted attributes along well path. This way, we have at the wells level the facies and the inverted attributes from seismic. We finally determined the facies from seismic using SeisPetro's proprietary software, which was coded in GoCAD. So the first step in the workflow was to normalize the horizontal gamma ray data. Since the area of interest was not very large, we were able to normalize the gamma ray from horizontals using a histogram. It is important to note that if the area was large, the histogram technique should not be used, as there are geological variations that need to be respected. These are the horizontal wells in a certain section, together with the vertical well before the normalization and after the normalization. In the pilot wells, we had detailed facies defined. They are shown here in the right. We had, and this is the legend, we have the tide rock, we have paxton, mudstone, and clay. All facies but the clay were considered brittle facies. So we merged the facies that were brittle and separate the non-brittle facies from there. So next step is that using only the gamma ray, we define a cutoff that allows us to differentiate between the two facies. And we were trying to maximize the differentiation between the two. Because of the gamma ray was normalized in the horizontals, we can then apply the same cutoff from that was calibrated in the vertical wells to the horizontal gamma rays. It is important to note that the distribution is not exactly the same because we have a sampling bias for the landing zone. So we were trying, all these wells were drilled trying to target the low gamma ray section. So we're going to have this tail here that is a bias in comparison to the vertical wells. The next step is to make sure that the time depth conversion of the seismic is adequate. In this image, we show the top of the interval in magenta, while the base is shown in this dark yellow here, and part C just below it. We can see how many of the horizontals are crossing the top of the interval, but the geosteering reports indicate all the wells stay within the interval the whole time. So this is not real, this is just a problem of the time to depth conversion. To correct for that, we review 160 geosteering surveys to add 3 to 4 control points in the surface modeling. So we calculated how much distance we have to the top and estimated and separated, calculated 3 to 4 points for each of the wells. The control points were added and incorporated in the modeling of the time to death conversion. So you can see these green points were coming all from the horizontal, the geosteering cross sections. And when you do that and you now force the surface to respect those points, so none of the horizontals are now crossing the top of the reservoir. Here is a side view that shows all the horizontals in one of the sections in the area of interest, that they all fall inside now between the interval. And also the placing of the horizontal was confirmed by the geologists, saying that they were more or less in the right position. They were not too close to the top or too close to the base. This is important because now we have, as we mentioned, we extracted the information. We need to extract information along the well path. So we have now the facies, the brittle rock facies that came from the horizontal gamma ray log data, and we can extract now the acoustic impedance and the BPBA ratio from the seismic. So these colors that, in the background here are the seismic data, and we're going to extract the information along the well path for each of the horizontal logs. And as you see here, this is a small section in the area of interest. With this data, now we can determine the facies using a frequentist approach, which is proprietary for site spectrum. The easiest way to explain the technology is to imagine a cross plot in which the axis data comes from seismic and the colors come from the well data. For example, here we have attribute A in the x-axis and attribute B in the y-axis. And the colors are the facies, which in this case, we have only two. The red is the target rock and the blue is the background. We then subdivide the cross plot into different cells and count how many points for each of the facies we have in each cell. So in this case here, we have 2 out of 7 is red, and in this one here, we have 5 of 9. So if we are between these attribute properties for attribute A and attribute B, we have a higher probability of finding the target rock than if we are in this range of values of attribute A and attribute B. It is called frequentist because you count the frequency of a certain facies given the attributes ranges. The strength of this technique is that you don't require a model or a prior like the Bayesian technique does. Going back to our case study, we have acoustic impedance in the x-axis and the BPBA ratio in the y-axis. The data in gray here is all the data from the seismic, but the points along horizontal well path, we have 103,000 approximately samples from the horizontal logs. If we color the horizontal log data with the facies, we have that the brittle rock here is represented in red and the non-brittle in blue. And that's what comes from the well, as I mentioned. We can see that the seismic data goes beyond our the range of data covered by the well data. So that's what we call the domain of probability analysis. In our workflow, we use certain interpolation and extrapolation rules to handle the cases outside the domain of probability analysis, which are not relevant for this presentation. After we run the algorithm, we can determine the facies along the wells and in the entire seismic volume. In this cross-section, we have in the first track, the brittle facies flag from the horizontal well data. If you remember, this we use a cutoff, in this case was 70, that I didn't mention before, and they have a sampling of every 5 feet. In the second track, has the brittle facies probability from seismic. So this is a probability. So what is the probability in this case of the brittle rock? And in the third track, for reference, we have the acoustic impedance. You can see the probability data has a better resolution than the original inverted attributes from seismic, which is very common when we do this kind of probability analysis because the probability is incorporated into different attributes. And you can see here in the wells 1, 2, for example, 5 and 7, where the blue give you more probability of the brittle facies, while in wells like the 3, 4, and well number 8, you have less probability, and the seismic is actually uh, predicting higher probability, just a little bit of probability where we have some of the facies um, selected by the log data. So now the facies probability can be incorporated into the geomodeling. We can select here. There is a selection of the seismic constraints. There is a way to do this, which is again not relevant for the presentation today. But not all the points need to be added. We can only add. We should only add the points where we have high confidence. We use the hard data from the horizontal data, the horizontal wells, and we can calculate also the vertical probability curve to do the geomodeling. In this case, for this example, we did the two facies model that allows us to then create a four facies model in more detail. To conclude, horizontal data is a rich source of information which is usually underutilized since it is difficult to incorporate for all the reasons that we mentioned before. There is not an exact recipe on how to incorporate the horizontal data. It will depend on the objectives of the project, the geological problem, and any other data that is available. Creativity is key in this kind of problems. Thanks for your attention. Please let us know if you would be interested to learn more about what we can do with your data. Thank you.